Okay, let's get started. So Bethany is gonna start now. I'll allow each of you of our presenters to kind of introduce themselves. But Bethany is going to be first, and then Ben and Lisette are going to be working together to kind of explain the nuts and bolts. But Bethany's giving you some kind of introductory background to family storytelling and its power and benefits. So, Bethany.
Okay, do you want me to share
Yeah,
from
sure.
my, okay, let me, And, okay, let me now find my chat, because I know people chat. No, I can't find my chat. Okay, I've got y'all. Hello, everybody. It's fun to see you again. It's been a little while, and I'm super excited to be able to talk about storytelling. Since I did this last year, I've actually been doing more presentations on storytelling. You all inspired me. And so in the last couple of months, I've done 2 presentations and to different audiences, because this topic I think is so important to such a variety of people. I talk to people who work with victims of child abuse, who help in preventing child abuse, and how storytelling can relate to burnout or preventing burnout and enjoying your job and motivation. I've spoken to teachers, particularly teachers who teach children who are at risk for a variety of factors, and how storytelling is important as the teacher and to the children. And so I'm just so excited to have one more place to be able to share this information with you. Quick introduction. I think most of y'all have heard this before. So I'm Bethany Bustamante Van Vliet. I teach at Arizona State University, and I teach about family. I teach about parenting, human development. I also do statistics and research methods, which I think is the fun stuff too. And I have children and a family that kind of motivates me in a new way in understanding family and storytelling. In fact, recently I realized even more deeply how important storytelling is. 2 of my children are adopted. I also have 2 foster children. And so we're constantly building and telling stories in our family related to these different life experiences. And my daughter, one of them that was adopted, recently came home and told me that one of the kids asked her at school, "Why does your mom not love you, that she let you go to another family?" And so I asked my daughter, and she's in, how old is she? She was in 3rd grade at the time. And I asked her, what'd you say? And she says, "Oh, I told them, no, my mom does love me, but she just couldn't take care of me. And so I went to live with another family who loves me so much." And that was a moment I realized we have been crafting her experiences into a story. And that story ended up being protective to her. It helps her be resilient. So we all have many experiences. We have good experiences, we have bad experiences, but how we create those into a story, and the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell others through our interactions and the things I'm about to talk about are really vital. Because that could be interpreted in many different ways, right? That could be one of those moments that just crushes you. And so that to me is one of the reasons why I think this is also so important. So I'm going to ask you some questions. And because I love to take too much time, I'm going to right now think about the answers to these questions yourself. Look at them and consider if you know the answers to any of these questions. How your parents met, how your grandparents met, where they grew up, why you have the name that you have. People that are grumpy and their face froze in a grumpy position, think of that. And then if you know the answer to any of these questions, you want to share the answer to one, I'm going to take 1 or 2 people to share your answer to one of these questions. I'm trying to save time for our amazing next speakers. So raise your hand. I'll see if I can see you if you want to share an answer to one of these questions. Or unmute. And you can also chat them. I'm trying to see. You all are quiet today. Okay. Yes, Aguiado.
Chidunim is joining us from Nigeria, and Chidunim, you may need to take off your headphones for us to hear you.
Yeah, I'm not with headphones. Can you hear me now?
Not so well.
Okay. It's better now.
It's a little better, yes.
Okay, so I want to answer the first question. How my parents met. So my dad and my mom's elder brother friends.
Chidunim, it's still not good enough that we can hear you. Perhaps you can get to a better place and then put the microphone up to your mouth.
Can I go on?
Let's hold off. Let's hold off on you for a moment and go to Eric from Burundi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to talk about how my parents meet. They always meet while there is a party. If there is no party or some bad times like a funeral or if there is somebody died, that is the moment that my parents meet or my family can meet together. Thank you.
And Leroy?
All right, so my parents met at a party that was hosted by my mom's best friend. And they grew up in Nemba County, in Tuota, Nemba County, Liberia. I'm up to answer all the questions altogether, right?
Just one.
Oh, okay, then that's all for now.
Bonus one. Awesome. I love that. And if you look in the chat, we've got some other stories. I love that one of you, the father got to choose the name if the baby was a girl, the mother chose if it was a boy. We have my mother's friend who was a nurse, like my mom told my mom to name the Bikram, princess and female ruler in old dynasties. I mean, right there, when you look at where our names came from, that's the beginning of our stories, right? We've got some meaning and depth and value that comes from that. I love that. 4 years ago, my grandfather lived with us. I spent time with them. Okay, so this is fantastic. Keep sharing if you have stories and information, answers to these questions, because it's so fun to see this. I wish we could hear from all of you, but again, this time I'm like determined. I'm going to get through all this information. I love hearing these stories. Okay, so you're probably wondering why I'm asking you these questions. I've got to chat because I'm distracting myself with your stories. Well, I'm asking these questions because these two people, Marshall Duke and Robin Fivish, used these same questions to do a study. And what happened was they had a clinical practice. So they did like therapy and counseling. And they started thinking there seemed to be some sort of relationship between people knowing family stories and some of the outcomes that they saw and how people were doing. And so they put together a survey or a list of questions, and it was 20 questions, and it's called the Do You Know survey. And what they did was they asked people these 20 questions, and they counted up how many answers they knew. And then they looked to see what those were related to. If people knew more answers to those questions, were there certain outcomes that seemed to be related to that? And so let's see what they found. So they found that people who knew more answers to these questions tend to have better emotional health and more happiness. They found that they tend to have a greater sense of control, which is really important in life. When you feel like you have some control over your environment, even if it feels limited, that's really leads to really healthy outcomes versus feeling like you are just everything is pushing on you and you can't do anything about it. So that sense of control is really important in healthy human development. They found that people who knew more answers to the questions tended to have higher self-esteem. They were more resilient. That means they're more able to get back up when things knock them down, when things are hard. People People who knew more answers to the questions were able to better handle stress. And knowing more of these stories was related to increased compassion and a stronger sense of identity in who you are. And they found that, again, knowing more answers was related to doing better in school and related to doing better socially. And they found lower levels of anxiety among people who knew more answers to these questions. And they also found that people who knew more answers tended to have fewer behavior problems. That's a pretty nice list there that seems to be related to knowing these stories. Because when you talk about family history and those questions, ultimately those are stories that we know. And I think we need all of those things, right, to a greater degree in our society right now. Now, not only did they find, or have we found, that there are individual benefits to knowing these types of stories and family storytelling. Okay, no questions yet, Fatima, but they're coming. So not only are there individual benefits that we just saw, resilience and coping and happiness, we've also found that there's benefits to the entire family when there's family storytelling, and that family storytelling can really strengthen families. They found in research that family storytelling relates to more positive perceptions of family functioning. So people feel better about how their family works together. They found that family storytelling is related to greater family cohesiveness, which is a big word for saying togetherness or feeling connected, which then relates to all sorts of other positive things when we feel connected to our families. And they've also found that family storytelling can be related to family and individual healing. And that as we tell stories, as we tell good and bad experiences and stories, that we're able to help build each other up. We're able to help cope. And one study says we naturally share good and bad experiences with others and witness that each member of family has refused to allow trauma to take away sense of self and family and witness their own resilience. Those are good things. All of these positive things grow out of our family storytelling and telling stories, even in general. So we learn answers to these kinds of questions, not in school, right? We learn important things in school, but these questions, we don't go to school and learn, how did your parents meet? You know, tell me how you got your name. That's not something we do there. But importantly, we learn those things through activities with our families, often through daily rituals and routines, and on car trips or road trips or something like that, taking walks around the block. We start telling this information and sharing these stories naturally, often in families. In fact, one of the strongest correlations or predictors, not necessarily predictor, relationships for children doing well in school is children having dinner with their family at least 3 to 5 days a week. And it's not necessarily the sitting at the table eating dinner part. If you sit there in silence as a family and eat dinner, we're probably not going to see those same positive outcomes. It's the storytelling and the conversations and the processes that happen while we sit together as a family. And so spending time together as a family is important because of these opportunities to talk and share these stories. We've also found that these stories help children feel a sense of pride and connectedness. And even when we feel ordinary, I think a lot of us sometimes feel like we don't have exciting, interesting stories to tell. At least I sometimes feel like that, you know, that you hear some of these amazing stories and you just feel like, wow, I wish those exciting things happened to me. But we all have amazing, unique stories that are really important. And sometimes it's even those day-to-day stories that can be really impactful. One of the researchers that I just talked about, Marshall Duke, said ordinary families can be special because they each have a history no other family has. They all have uncle so-and-so, they all have aunt so-and-so, they all have a brother who went off and did this adventure, and everyone has a story that no one else has. So if you know that, it makes you special, and it's a fingerprint. So remember that, all of you have really special stories to share. So it's important to remember those 20 questions are predictors of all really good things. But me telling, if I tell you, go learn the answers to those 20 questions, it's not going to like solve all the world's problems. We're not instantly going to be more compassionate and do better in school and have kids that, it's not those answers by themselves, it's the processes that happen when we tell stories and learn stories. So when we talk about storytelling, it involves communication. In telling the story and listening to the story, we're learning skills, we're learning values, we're learning to listen to other people's perspectives. That's really important. And that's part of why storytelling has some of these really positive benefits. There's also the connection that happens when we tell stories. When we tell stories, it's very rarely one person by themselves in the story. We're having to learn to think how other people saw and experienced the story with us. We're also talking to somebody and sharing a new perspective with somebody else as we tell the story. We're learning to combine different experiences into one narrative. And so that connection piece of storytelling is very important and has benefits to people telling and listening to the stories. And there's also the emotional piece. There's a lot to be said for the emotions that are elicited in hearing stories and in telling stories. It draws people in, which also releases chemicals that can build connection. So a lot of these things are interconnected. And this communication, this connection, the emotion that we feel as part of storytelling has been found in research to increase empathy. One reason for that could be the oxytocin that's produced. So that's, chemicals in the brain that help bring people together. But also, as we put a face to problems, as we put a face, as it humanizes people through their stories, we're better able to empathize and understand other people, even people who might feel really different from us. And also, storytelling inspires questions and curiosity. And questions and curiosity, I think, are the root for just amazing things, for connection, for understanding, for empathy. We also know that stories are one of the best ways to communicate purpose. And so as we hear stories, we can develop purpose. As we tell and build stories, we are developing a sense of purpose, whether it's our meaning for being here, it's why we do what we do, our motivation. That purpose is really important, and it can come through storytelling. We also know that research has found storytelling can inspire action. Compelling stories have the power to change attitudes and beliefs, encourage people to do things that are compassionate. Maybe they looked at studies where people who encountered a story were then more likely to donate more money or give more time to volunteer work. And it results in kindness, generosity, and cooperation. So these stories are more than just, oh, that was nice. Like, I have a good feeling about that now. Research has found that stories lead people to do things. And it's really hard to get people to do things often. And so we sometimes underestimate the importance of these stories and putting a face to a problem or an issue that's important to us. And so this is where we also see the connection between our family stories and being a family diplomat. Stories foster understanding and compassion, not just in your family, but beyond your family, for people outside of your family. So through our family stories and our personal experiences and stories, we're able to encourage action and understanding. So think of the power that you have with the stories that you're telling here to make things happen. So I'm telling you this stuff about family because I want you to remember that as we do storytelling, it's important here, and it's important beyond. And so I think you can keep both of those things in mind as you learn the things that you're about to learn about storytelling. Just really quickly, there's different types of stories within families. And family stories, we tend to see 3 different types. And I think some of this can apply or something to be considered as we think of the other stories that we tell even outside of the family. There's an ascending family narrative. Those are the stories of, when we came to this country, we had nothing, we worked, we opened a store, and now we have it all. Now you're going to college and, that kind of a story where it seems just all the good things that build up. There's the descending family narrative, which says we used to have it all, and then we lost everything. And then there's the oscillating family narrative, which, just like this picture, includes the ups and the downs. This is the stories of, we built a family business, your grandfather was a pillar in the community, your mother was on the board at the hospital, but then we had setbacks, your uncle was arrested, the house burned down, your father lost a job, but no matter what happened, we stuck together as a family. Sorry, I'm speaking so fast. It's because I'm trying to give I feel like our star speakers more time. I'm sorry, I will slow down. Slow down and cut out information. And I'm excited. I'm just one of those, I'm a fast speaker, so I apologize. Okay, slowing. It's so hard. So these different types of stories are important because they can have different impacts on people. What we found is that when it comes to family narratives, the oscillating family narrative tends to be the most beneficial for children. And that's because when we tell stories of either everything gets better or everything gets worse, we're ignoring the fact that our stories or the stories we experience are often chapters in our life. We might have a chapter that's really crummy, that's really hard, but with an oscillating story or narrative, we understand that's not the end. We're not stuck at the bottom of this curve here. Things are going to go up. And so that's part of what helps build resilience. And I think in all of these things, it's important to understand that stories are not just about the experience you're telling. So You can tell a story that's about a very tragic circumstance, a very sad story, but yet the message can lead to something uplifting and meaningful and positive action. So it does. I don't want us to think that we should only tell happy, ascending narrative type stories. We can have the hard things in there, and it's important. Okay, so you're going to learn about amazing storytelling skills today, but also in the back of your mind, I want you to remember the importance of your own lives. And also, as you build your stories for this program, some of these steps can help you because it's easy to forget or discount or not appreciate some of the things happening to us. And so the way we capture our own stories, make sure you write down your stories. As you think of things, I asked you where you got your name from. If you haven't done it, write it down, record it, or tell it to somebody. Make sure it's out there. Tell someone how your grandparents met. Discuss family history stories with people. Share them with people around you, even if it's not just your family. You can share it outside of your family because those stories can build people, and you don't realize who you can help through your stories. Consider a mission statement. Eat meals together. That's where we create. That's where we share stories. Have fun. We often tell stories when we're having fun together. Make sure you share family customs and traditions. Often those support storytelling moments. Celebrate milestones, because as we celebrate them, we're creating stories and we also share stories. Make sure you share or you collect memorabilia. Talk about them. If you have a favorite rock, my son collects rocks from everywhere. Write the story down about that rock. Where were you when you found that rock? And one of the most important things, I think, and as we go throughout this training, relates to being intentional. We need to think about those types of stories we're telling, and we need to think about the action we're trying to inspire. And this is true for inside your family and outside of your family. So some stories can be positive and healthy, and some aren't positive and healthy. What is the meaning that it's giving us? How are we interpreting it, either personally, in our family, or beyond that? So again, it's not just about the experience, whether it's positive or negative, but it's about the meaning we're giving it. We don't want to use stories to manipulate, to control people. It's particularly in families. And research has shown, I love this reminder, stories can bring people together or divide us. The same chemicals that inspire compassion can also lead us to define who is in and out of our group. So we have a lot of power here in storytelling. And I'll just leave you with this last quote that I think emphasizes how important what you're about to hear is. We need to look at our own responsibility for the well-being of others and cultivate awareness of the impact of our own stories, of our own power over the bodies of other people. What intentions do we bring to the stories we tell? Are we using our power to lift people up and help them to see solutions to problems we face as individuals and as groups? Or are we using our power to reveal the worst in ourselves and pit people against each other? Do we communicate things that make us feel good about ourselves or that make us feel worse? Stories bring us together, but they can also tear us apart. They can bring us joy, but they can incite hatred. We are all born with the power to tell stories. It is a power we need to learn to use well and wisely, which luckily for us is what we're doing today and what you're going to talk about today. So I will turn the time over. I will stop sharing now.
Great, Bethany, thank you. Bilal, as I mentioned in the Zoom chat and to everybody, you'll have a recording of this, a video recording, and you'll also have the slides. So you'll be able to kind of go back, and if you didn't quite hear what Bethany said because she was speaking quickly, you'll be able to go back. Before the next, actually, Ben, before you share screen, I just want to take a photo of everybody while we're in between sessions. So if you guys can turn on your cameras briefly, for those of you who don't have them on, Bilal, Nusrat, Zineng, and Joshua. And I'm going to take a couple of photos just to make sure we have good ones. On 3, if you can smile. 1, 2, 3. And perfect. And then again, on 3, if you can smile. 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Thank you guys. Ben and Lisette, you are next.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Ben Yavitz. It's my second year doing this. I'm located in Washington, D.C., and my background is really in education. Currently, I'm running my own firm where I consult companies on presentation, design, and messaging. But I started my career actually teaching elementary and middle school before shifting a number of ways in my career. But I'm excited to really talk to you today about storytelling, because storytelling is something that we all do, both professionally and personally. So I think you guys will really enjoy what we all have to say today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisette Alvarez. I am a storyteller from a professional standpoint. I do fiction. I do fiction podcasts with my production company, Stormfire Productions. I also have a background in digital marketing and storytelling through the digital world. I am specifically interested in oral and audio storytelling. Some of you might be more familiar. Some countries have more radio and oral storytelling traditions than in the United States specifically, which is where I am based. But it is one skill and one type of storytelling that I'm very interested in. I'm really excited to share some of the background that I have in the acting, writing, and theater world and oral storytelling world. A lot of what I'm going to be sharing and Ben is going to be sharing are going to be practical skills that you can apply to improve your storytelling skill set. Yeah.
So we'll jump right in. Why is storytelling important? And you heard little tidbits already, but there's really two sides of it, personal and professional. And think about it when be it with your family, your friends, you're always talking about something. It could be something as simple, what happened to you during the day, or, a family story, anything. We're always really storytelling, and it's really important. And a lot of times we don't actually even think about the fact that we're storytelling, because maybe we just think about a small trip to the store and just something happened, but these stories are really part of what make us us. And then but then there's also the professional side, and that's also what's going to be really important here, because throughout what you do in your career, from the very start, to anywhere you end up, we're always telling stories. If you are working in sales, you might be selling to someone, you're telling someone a story about what you're trying to sell and how maybe it will improve your lives. If you think about when you see a commercial on the TV and you're thinking about what story are they trying to tell you. But really, anything you are doing professionally. I started my career as a teacher. I'm being a teacher again. But when I started teaching in elementary school and I'm working with kids, I'm telling stories throughout the day to engage them in their learning, so they're more interested in what I have to say, as opposed to just maybe something that may not be as interesting. So I need to think about how they're going to be engaged. But whatever you do professionally, when you go in for an interview, you're telling a story about yourself, and you have to think about how they want to hear about you and how you want to present yourself. So you're thinking about your story. So really, storytelling is really weaved into everything we do in our lives. Lisette, did you want to add anything to this?
Just to emphasize how important storytelling is, not just as an instinct, we naturally tell stories. I see Fatima just put that storytelling is a tradition in Fatima's culture. And I find this is important to understand how stories affect your culture, has affect and how you see yourself, who and how you see your community and your country, the history of your country, as well as understanding that even if everyone does tell stories all the time, storytelling is still a skill. It's a skill to practice. And what we're trying to balance here is have that personal and professional skill set be developed. All right, so moving from there, to get this understanding of a skill set, we have to slow down and actually ask ourselves not just what is a story, but what is a good story? What is considered a good hook? What makes the skill set appropriate for use to truly use to leverage change in your lives, in your professional lives, in your family's lives? So we're going to start by really asking, what is a good hook? The first thing that is communicated in a story that makes people pay attention. So it answers the question, why should I listen to your story? A good hook is clear and simple. So for example, The Wizard of Oz is a movie, an American movie, and it has a very straightforward plot, which is once upon a time, a young girl is whisked away away from her home to a magical land, and she must find a way to get back. It has three primary points of that hook. It's a one sentence, if you noticed. It is one sentence. It's simple and clear. And we know the other aspects. We know who is affected, who this story is about, the girl. We know what has happened, something that has occurred. She's whisked away to a magical land, and what she wants to do and what obstacle she has to overcome. She must find her way back home. Those components make a really easy hook. You might have a more complex story you want to tell, but in order to have a great story, a good hook, you must be able to take that complicated story and be able to just write one sentence that clearly defines who this story is about, what has happened, what occurs, what change happens, and what the character, the who, what they're trying to do to get back, or what is their goal, what is the obstacle in their way. It's very simple and clear. Storytelling at its heart, and the reason why it's almost always so compelling, is that it's truth telling through lying with a little bit of a twist. Right? Even when you are telling a true story, something that has happened to you, a memory, for example, you are telling the story from the perspective of someone who is now in the future from that story. So it's a little bit untrue. When you speak about what happened, you are speaking about the past. You're speaking of a version of the past. But that is still it's an interesting dynamic, and it's something to look into, especially when considering the why. When Bethany talked about why storytelling is so important and it's powerful, showing and sharing the truth is also very powerful. So being careful what kind of truth, what version of the truth you are sharing is also really important, and also creates a good story. So back to how Bethany mentioned how to select a story, what kinds of stories there are in your family. Here are a couple of ways you can ground your story in a good foundation. So cultural stories, folk tales. I see Ayoto mentioned storytelling being in Ogba stories, animals. Those are really good stories to root into, or even make a comparison to. If you're telling a story to somebody else that is about a memory, consider when you're looking at your stories, does any of your stories have a theme or a lesson or a moral in your own personal life that is similar to a folktale or fairy tale from your culture? Because that can actually make you more interested in your own story, for one, and it also provides more cultural context to your story and your experience. And it helps you it helps you memorize it better. Bilal mentioned it helps you memorize it for longer. The other source that is really helpful, and this goes back again to cultural stories, is multi-generational experiences. Again, back to what Bethany mentioned, it's really important to have as a part of a story something that transcends time or has multiple iterations of time. So understanding what was different in time in the different parts of your story and how the different parts of your story connect to different times and what makes those things different. You're grounding it in reality, and the more experience you have, the more experience you hear from other people in your families, or you think about yourself of the reason why this happened is because it was at this particular time of my life. I was a certain age. I reacted differently because I was a teenager rather than an adult. Having that context grounds your story. The other aspect of this is physical or digital mementos, memorabilia. We'll talk a little bit more about that, about when you're telling a story, that sometimes having props are useful. We'll get to that later on, though. The last part of what, I actually know this story that tells how a spider is in the corner of our room. I love Anansi stories. One of my favorite stories, or set of cultural stories. I have a couple of books of Anansi stories, so we'll hold on to that. If anybody's interested in the how a spider is at the corner of our room, I believe there's an Anansi story. There might be other stories too that actually answer that question. I love those stories, but that's, again, we can relate to stories that are familiar or seem familiar, because folk tales and cultural stories are very powerful, and they're ancestral. And again, that helps ground our stories. If we know maybe our story is a little bit similar to a folk tale that we once heard when we were a child. That actually also goes to what I'm about to talk about, which is the E button. Now, what is the E button? It is our emotions. Bethany also mentioned emotions being highly powerful, a part of storytelling. When we're talking about emotions, when you talk about memory, our memories are triggered, are brought up by emotion, by grief, by joy, by specifically strong emotions, right? So when we talk about creating a story or selecting what story we want to tell, one of the biggest things that creates emotion in a story is conflict. That there's some sort of obstacle in the way, that it's not just one time I woke up, I drank my coffee, I took a nice walk, and I get back home. That's not a fun story. That's not a great hook. There's no conflict. So being able to identify and examine conflict in your story will help bring more emotions and connect other people with that story as well. One of the things to be careful about and to understand, however, is to separate your story from your audience's story. That your story, again, it's truth telling. You're telling the truth, but with a little bit of a twist. When you are selecting your story and you're writing it down or considering how to tell it, you need to sometimes take a step back outside yourself and consider how this story will sound to someone else who doesn't know this story. Being able to look at it from that perspective, you'll be more intentional of what kind of emotions you want to generate in someone else. So finally, while being careful, however, doesn't mean being cautious. I am someone who truly believes that storytelling and creative work, artistic work, is audacious, is sometimes even dangerous. It itself can generate conflict. However, you should not be afraid to tell your truth. That is one of the biggest ways to select a story. Are you telling something that is true and needs to be heard, that hasn't been said before? That is the audacity to speak. And that, I think, is the biggest drive to why you should be telling stories. And that's fine. Is there any questions? I'm going to check in the chat before we move on. That's me. I love hearing you tell stories at night. It's good habit. This is great, why we tell stories and how we tell it and what it actually changes. And you still feel joy and happiness when different stories, yeah, Farzana, when told by our elders, we connect to that childlike part of ourselves. I just talked with an expert oral storyteller a few weeks ago, and one of the things she said to me is that though children also need stories and they're so ready to dive into stories, children are ready to, adults, it's harder to reach them. This is why we're trying to slow this process down and why this works, because if you're going to be talking to other adults, you need to understand, how are you going to connect to their child selves? The fact that adults need stories even more to access that joy. And I think that is really, really wonderful. And Bilal, I think that we love fiction stories, but how to listen to real life stories and how to construct them is super important. I'm saying anything else here? It's Refine sharing stories.
Leroy,
Yeah,
did you
building. Yes.
Yes, I just want to know if you can also include emotion in the heart of the story, or you can just give the hook in order to get the minds of the audience, of your audience, so as to listen to what your story is all about, or you can first include the real or the real emotion in the hook at the beginning or at the first part of the story.
So this I will say it depends, because sometimes, you yourself, if you're telling a story, you know what emotions are going to come. You know, because you've experienced it, you know what the ending is going to be. So if you are trying to, what I'm trying to say is don't spoil the ending necessarily. You can hint at what kind of story this is going to be through the good hook, and you can show emotions of why you think this is an interesting story, but let me get you to that point. But be careful, because what you want to do when you're telling a story is invite people first. You don't want to have strong emotions right up front, because that'll just sometimes turn people off. The people are not as interested, or they're not convinced yet in the very beginning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes.
All right, we're gonna move on and keep putting those questions in as they come, and we will try and get to all of them. So now, obviously, Lisette just started telling us about kind of the beginning of the story structure. So now we're really going to go through the entire arc. So the story structure. So you can see this arc on the screen represents everything from the beginning of the story to the end. And also some stories may have multiple bumps, right? If it's a longer story, you might see this go up and down throughout the story. So we call the beginning, the introduction, a warm invitation. So, people are getting warmed up to the story. And that can happen in, again, a lot of different ways. We've all heard a lot of different stories. Some start with a bang, and some may just kind of be really calm in the beginning, warm you up to something. And there's no wrong or right there. It just depends on the type of story. And that's like we were just talking about, the hook. You want someone to get interested right away. Why should I listen to this story? And if you think about books that you've picked up or a show you've watched, sometimes, something happens in the first few minutes because they want to really hook you. If you're watching a drama on TV and maybe it starts out with an explosion, or there's an accident or a murder, and because they want you to get interested and stay interested. And if you think about it, think for a moment, raise your hand right now if you've read the first, few pages of a book, or watched a few moments of a TV and turned it off. Think about when that's happened, right? When, we've all had that book and you're like, I'm not interested in that. Turn on a new show. I didn't get interested in the first few minutes. So I don't want to listen to that. We're not going to waste our time. So it has to be a good hook. And also maybe you were just the wrong audience, and that's okay as well. The next piece, as we're moving up the line here, is context. Maybe you're hooked in, but now you really need to know a little bit more information to stay engaged. So that's why we have where and when did it take place? Tell me a little bit about who the main character is and what did they want? So, you're interested, but to be invested, that's where they start telling you more about characters. You may identify with the character, you may know about the location, or maybe you're just interested to learn more about wherever they are. But that's where that context is important. And as Joseph put, it's all about making that connection. And some other people are talking about that as well. Yeah, when you connect with that story, that hook, that context, you're going to stay engaged. The next piece, kind of the middle part, is the rising action, which we'll call embody the conflict. So we call that the first part, the challenge. What was the problem or opportunity the characters in the story ran into? Sometimes the problem can be something, it can be a tragedy. Something happens, like they said, something happened. There was a murder. But it could be an opportunity. It could be about someone trying to find their new path in life. They're going on a journey to find themselves. It could for anything from like a new career, or they're moving to a new place. I'm saying these in a simplified way, but but that can be a problem. Doesn't always have to be something tragic. Depends on what type of story it is. Now we have the conflict. What did they do about it? Again, if we're talking about a story that started with a murder, maybe the conflict is, how are we going to solve this murder? What are they going to do? Think about any of these detective shows. But if it's a conflict of something, people going through changing, a story, it could be a story about someone starting a new career. Well, do they have to go back to school? Who are they talking to learn about what they want to do so that they can move forward to get that new career? And these are very different stories. And you might be interested in one and not the other, but just know the conflict sometimes can be tragedy, sometimes it's not tragedy at all. It's just more of a journey through life. Then we move to the following action. So go big or go home. Now, again, this one story might include just one part of each of these, whereas another story may have a lot of ups and downs, and which you may see in a longer story. The other thing you may see if you could think of an entire story as this whole piece, but then if it's a long story, if you zoomed in closer to this, you might see a lot of bumps along the way. So that's where we come to the resolution. How did it turn out in the end? So keeping kind of with the two examples. So resolution, did the murder go on, was it something where they did all this work and the murder went unsolved? That can happen. You can have a story with maybe that's I would say it's a murder, there's always something bad, but maybe some stories are left open because maybe there's a reason for that. Or it could be a resolution where they solve, they solve the murder case. The person who is, the story about someone kind of changing careers could be, what did they find? They find the story could end up being the resolution. How did it work? Did they end up with that new career? Or maybe they just decided to stick with what they had. So that, that's that resolution. How did it actually turn out? People want to know that. So if your story is missing how it turned out in the end, you're gonna keep people wanting. And then a lesson. And I think a lot of people talked about this already in the chat with various stories, be it anything from their own culture, religion, stories with morals. What did you learn from it? And some stories can have, as very important lessons about life, and some may not. And again, this is also goes back to finding that importance in that lesson. Was this story directed for you? And that's again something to think about. Some stories I would say we can read, and they have very universal messages. And they might be told in different ways, like a story that you might tell a 5-year-old as opposed to a story that might tell an adult. You might want to share the same lesson, but you would have to share it in a different way so it's at their level. But every good story is going to need to have all of these parts. So when you go to write a story and you're thinking about the stories you want to tell in life, be it professionally or personally, and obviously you all are going to be writing a story, thinking about the stories you want to write, this is going to be a guide where if you read your story and it does not, and it's missing any of these pieces, then that's something that you need to add. Just peeking up at the chat for a second. Sometimes we share our tragedies and mishaps of our life, but after sharing our stories, we are feeling relaxation and sometimes bad experiences. And some give us strength and self-motivation. I really like this, to cope with our life strategies. Everyone has stories in their life, and although they, and some are good and some are bad. And I think that's really important. That's sharing, as we've been talking about, sharing stories and tragedy, and happiness and everything in between. Those are important. They all give us things we need. And then the final piece here is the action. What do you think I should do now? So again, you think about if there was a moral, what do they learn? You can think about what will happen in the future, what will happen in the future. If there, it can be something where it can be a lesson about, think about more as a lesson about stealing, about telling the truth. If the moral, say, is that you should always, tell the truth, then, what the action, you can think about how in the future, and I'm going to make sure to be a more honest person, thinking about those actions. And that's why a lot of these stories have lessons, so that we can learn from them, and maybe we can often better ourselves. And we know a lot of times that's where a lot of those cultural storytellings happen, because we're trying to teach ourselves, to be better people. All right. Now this chart, again, you will be getting these slides at the end. This is something, I put together just so when you go through your stories, you'll be able to easily go through these questions, with each of these steps. And obviously the one that you didn't see in the arc in the beginning is, who is your audience? What do you want them to think, feel, or do after hearing your story? So these will be things that you think about as you write your own story and refine it. And I give examples, what does that sound like on the side, just to help you out. So you'll have more time to look at this when you get the slides, but I just wanted to let you know that this is something that is there for you as a tool. All right, in this section, I'm going to would like to ask for some help here in reading, if anybody feels comfortable. And then after we, read this, we're going to go through and identify the different parts of the story. Could I get a volunteer to help read the story? Any volunteers?
Can I read?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Identifying the parts of a story. I remember the day my brother went missing. It was the hot summer of 1989 in my hometown, St. Louis. I was turning 9 in a couple of months and enjoying the rest of my summer break. On this day, I was shooting some hoops in my backyard when I heard my mom call for my little brother Daniel. After Daniel didn't answer, my mom appeared in the backyard. When she didn't see him, her face dropped as I saw worry wash over her face. My brother Daniel was only 3 years old and he was missing. My mom, dad, and I searched our home, but we couldn't find him. We called out his name, Daniel, Daniel, but he didn't answer. My dad and I walked up and down the blocks in our neighborhood, but we still couldn't find him. With nowhere else to search, my mom called the police for help. Then the police arrived quickly, and I listened as my mom provided them with a description of my brother. With nothing left to do, I decided to go back to shooting hoops in my backyard. As I walked down the pathway that cuts between my home and my neighbors, I heard a soft giggle. I took a few more steps and it got louder. Then I saw tiny toes peeking out from under our barbecue cover. My brother's toes. Daniel had been hiding there all along with the wisdom of a 3-year-old. Daniel had started a game of hide and go seek. Unfortunately, he failed to let anyone else know. We never assumed Daniel would purposely hide from us, nor did we assume he wouldn't answer when we called his name. In the future, we will have to think like a 3-year-old.
Thank you so much. That was great. So this is actually this is actually about my brother, and this is my story. So this happened when I was a little kid, and my parents were really freaking out. So thank you for reading my story. So we are going to now go identify parts of this story. So here we have what we just went over. And you can see I put little simple explanations. So starting with the hook. Who can tell me which part of the story is the hook? Yes, Mohammed?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I think the last part of the first paragraph, that is the hook, which is, on this day I was shooting some hoops in my backyard when I heard my mom call for my little brother Daniel.
Well, you're close, and I can see but that we're missing. What's the part that's really grabbing the attention first? You want to think about that again, Mohammed? Oh, you're on mute.
Someone else will answer it, but
oh yeah, that's fine.
I will be, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, Chia?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ben. The hook, I think, is I remember a day my brother went missing.
That's right. So that's the idea that, okay, this is something kind of through the idea of I wanted to throw everybody right into the action. So like, oh my God, my brother went missing. And some of this, what we're going to get into later is, obviously this is, I asked for a volunteer, and thank you for reading this. When you go to tell your own stories and you really know the story, then you're going to be able to know when to emphasize things. So I might say, I remember the day my brother went missing, and really, putting that emphasis on it. And then again, I know my story, so I know how I would read it. So that's going to be a different experience when you read someone else's stories. But that also will help with where, what you think is important, what maybe, what grabs your attention. So yes. So now where do you think the context is? That's the next section.
Beginning with after Daniel didn't answer.
Not quite. We're skipping ahead.
The context?
Go ahead.
I mean, if you answer those questions about the context and where, when, and who actually, where it was, the backyard actually, yeah, and when it is clearly on the hot summer,
Oh yeah, 1989. Yeah.
Yeah, and also who are with Mom and Daniel.
Right. So that's right. So that's that next paragraph, right? So we know we actually, really have the 1989 hometown of St. Louis. Obviously, I have I, so you don't know who I is. Now it's me, but it's that person, and you find out that's that person's brother, and Daniel. So you have your main you have your main characters right there in that next paragraph. All right. Now what is the challenge? Problem and opportunity. Nasrat, am I saying that right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the next it's after Daniel didn't answer, my mom appeared in the backyard. I think these two lines are challenges.
Yeah, that's correct. We know mom came to the backyard. She was worried. She can't find Daniel. He's missing. So we know that's the problem in this case. He's missing. So great job there. Now what is the conflict? And remember, conflict is what did they do about it? So what did the characters in the story do about it after the problem? I see some hands up again. Anybody new want to jump in? before I go back? And you take a moment to look. All right, I'll jump back to you, Mohammed. Go ahead.
Well, the question is, what did they do about it? So, when after he didn't listen, so they start searching. It means that conflict starts. They start searching their neighborhood, and they called out his names, and that they again couldn't find, and then they went to the police. So the police arrived quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. Exactly. That whole paragraph in green is everything they were doing, and I said we were doing. I should say we were doing to help find Daniel. So now, what is the resolution? So what happened in the end after all the searching? So, anyone? Take a look at what's left in the story. All right, Farzana.
Yes, I think the second last part of the story, when they decided to go back to the shooting house in the backyard, and they decided to search. I think this is the part of the resolution.
That's spot on, right? In this case, I went back, to look, just to go shoot hoops, and then we heard the giggling, and there's Daniel. So that's so he ended up revealing himself slightly at the end with his toes and giggles. So that's what happened. And now, next part, what's the lesson? What did you learn? Or what did we learn, or what did the characters learn? Eric? Eric, you got to take yourself off mute.
I think this is the last part of this of this passage. This last said, we never. I can see well.
Assumed, yeah.
Yeah, we can never assume Daniel would purposely hide from us. Nor did we assume he wouldn't answer when we called his name.
That's right. Yep. So if we're looking for someone who's lost, right, we'd assume that if they're close by, they'd answer. But obviously, we didn't know that he'd play a game. So this is something we learned, and maybe we'll learn if another child is missing, we might think a little differently. Maybe he's not actually lost. And then obviously the last piece, which is all that's left, recommended action. What do you think I should do? And obviously the obvious here, I put in the future, we have to think like a 3-year-old. So when we were searching and calling, we thought, oh, someone's going to answer if they are nearby. But because he was, in his mind, he was playing a game, he didn't think he was supposed to answer because he thought we were playing hide and go seek. So sometimes you have to kind of think differently, and you have to think about, and this goes back to thinking about your audience. We didn't know that he wouldn't answer, so now we knew. And obviously this didn't happen again to my knowledge, but it's something to think about. And you can think about lessons, this also can think about lessons in life. Sometimes you may make certain assumptions, but you have to think about what, other people and how the people that you're looking for may react. So that's you can think about multiple lessons. And that's another thing. Sometimes you may get a lesson from a story that may not be intended. And that's okay too.
I actually want to hop on that because this is something I find sometimes interesting.
Yeah,
is that sometimes when you're creating your story, if you want to be a little bit more complicated about it, you might have an initial desire, right? When you talk about, there might be an initial desire from the main character, like, I want to have a new job. But the lesson at the end was maybe the job you had all along was the best job for you. That sometimes you can create lessons that are surprising, and sometimes those are the best stories that have surprising lessons. And I think it's a little bit surprising is like, oh, something you don't often think about is having to think like a 3-year-old.
Mm-hmm. All right. And again, thank you guys for participating in this. We're gonna move on. And again, if you end up with additional questions, please put them in the chat, because we will also go back and have time at the end for additional questions that we don't have time for along the way.
All right. And talking about character building or understanding characters, I'm going to talk a little bit about how, when you're telling a story, you can better understand people, because all of our stories, most of them at least, and I'm assuming the family stories are going to be primarily about people, unless you want to talk about any pets you have. But understanding people is a big part of storytelling. So, of course, you have to be careful whenever you're talking about a story about a real person. And this is one of the ways in which you can be more empathetic when you're developing your story, is again, taking that step back, even looking at yourself from a different perspective. If you are part of the story, or if it's another person in a part of your story, you want to, obviously, you don't want to tell complete lies about real people, but you also don't want to completely make them perfect either. Those aren't interesting characters. Sometimes the most interesting, compelling characters are complicated ones, are ones that have interesting quirks. So when you're telling your story about an uncle who has a funny laugh, think about what are interesting aspects of their character that makes them unique people. Insert that into the story that makes it more interesting. You also want to think about what's the motivation. Why would a mother care about whether or not her child is missing? There's a motivation there. You want to say why this person cares about this problem. I'm seeing here, your father would be a great character. He's so expressive. Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why you want, when you're thinking about creating a story, think about interesting characters in your family, including yourself, and what makes them interesting, and what stories highlight what makes them interesting. Also consider when you, because I believe in this practice, you'll be able to bring your family members alongside you sometimes, or have them involved in the creation of this story. So I suggest you interview them, ask these questions about how they experienced this time, how they described themselves in that part of their life, or even what it was like to live in that part of the story that you're telling the story in. If it was back in 1989, I would say, for example, I would ask Ben, what was your mother like? How did she experience the summer of 1989? Like, what was she worried about running after her 2 sons all the time? That creates interesting stories. So consider talking to the people that are part of the stories you plan to tell. And finally, we're going to move into the last section of this skill set and workshop is going to be embodiment. How to embody the story and the characters in the story. So yes, maybe you might want to practice, Juliana, how those expressions, if you can even mimic the expressions of your father, if you want him as a part of the story. But we'll show you a couple of different ways you could potentially even do that, or consider how you want to take up space. Any questions on character building? Eric, I see that you have your hand up. Is that for a question, or was that? Okay.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen just for a second for this next part. Give me 1 second. All right. So for this next piece, we're going to talk a little bit about body and space.
And
so
Ben, I'm sorry to bother you for a second.
Okay.
I'm going to take another photo because we have a couple of other people who joined.
Oh, sure.
So if you guys don't mind, quickly. On 3, have your cameras on, Nusrat, Zineng, and Joshua, if you're willing. On 3, 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Let me do that one more time. On 3, 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
All right, so I've stopped sharing because I want, obviously you guys have control over my screen, but you know, I want you to be able to actually focus on my screen as opposed to a slide. So when you think about body and space, think about, you know, if you're looking at my screen, you can see what's around me. So this is my office / guest room. I don't really have much up right now, and I actually even took something down because I didn't want it to be distracting. So when you're telling a story, you think about where you are. In this case, we're on Zoom. So if I had a lot of different things behind me, then that may be really distracting. And you can see some of my co-speakers, they've actually blurred the background, which is another helpful way where they have stuff in the background and they don't want to clear out their space, but they can blur the background so that they are more of the focus. And, you know, everybody has a little bit of different things in the background, but that's something really important when you're speaking. You know, be it, you know, and you see this used from when you're watching TV to what's in the background of characters in a movie, to, you know, if you're watching, you know, going to a concert, going to a talk in person or video, you know, what the surrounding areas makes an impact on your experience. Sometimes you have control, sometimes you don't, but again, in Zoom, in this case, you have some control over where you decide to, say, put your computer or blurring the background, because that can impact people's focus. The next part is your body. You know, I often will talk with my hands, and I see a lot of other people do, but the other thing is to be able to see what you're doing matters as well. So if I want to have an impact, I want to get really close to the camera, that's going to have a different impact if I zoom all the way back here. And I'm just also, things to note, like I'm just using the mic on my computer. So you might have, the volume of my voice may have changed as well because I went farther away. So these are things you have to take into an account. And if you are someone, for instance, that wants to talk with your hands and you want to use them for emphasis, if I'm on Zoom, I need to pay attention to where my body is, because if I'm this close and I'm doing something with my hands, you can't see it. But if I back up and I want to do something with my hands for emphasis, then you can actually see what's going on. So it's important to be aware of self. And actually, there has been studies on this. So if you are watching someone speak, and say you just put them on mute and you just see how they act, and then you put them, and then you watch them with full volume, you may get different reactions to it, because depending on how your face, you know, what your face looks like and what they're doing with their hands, when they're on mute, they may look more engaging, and people may think, depending on what you're doing, oh, that's a happy person, a sad person, that person looks trustworthy. You know, think about when you look at politicians, you know, and without even, you know, and think about, oh, or just, you know, I say, forget even politicians, you're walking around down the street and you instantly have reactions to people who might look, oh, that person looks friendly, that person looks mean or trustworthy. You don't know anything else about them, but maybe you just saw them and you're having a reaction because of what you're seeing. And so when you're telling the story, you can control what you do, so you can be really intentional about your voice, if I want to slow down or really speed up, and everything else, because that matters. And then you get props. So then I have, you know, if I want to be, you know, put props on, and I have a mask. And so what do you want? How do you want to tell your story? I've got, what else do I have here? You know, I can be a tiger, or now these can just be fun props for a show, but you obviously you can also bring items that actually really matter to you. If you're telling a story of something about your family, you may have a prop. Hey, my grandfather gave me this, or here's a photo that I want you to do, that I want to share. And then you can make it very personal and meaningful. So these, and props also can be, I mean, as we know in Learning Life, on some of the calls you're asked, you know, bring a family member, you know, obviously a person, we don't want to think of a person as a prop, but you're bringing someone in essentially to help you out that regularly wouldn't be there. So that's part of, you know, they're a prop in that sense. But you know, think about what you can use to help tell your story. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Ben, just to follow up on what you just said, I want to remind you guys, so some of you are aware, because you were in our training last year, that a few of you who ended up winning awards for your storytelling actually did use props. So for instance, Chirunim, who's with us now from Nigeria, when he was telling this kind of horrific story about human trafficking, not in his family, but in a family that he knows, he brought up at some point, you know, some objects that that they had as they were making on their journey, trying to get to Europe, this particular man and woman, a husband and wife. And so that's one example. But another one of you last year, this one of our FD trainees from Costa Rica had a map behind him. And then at some point he brought up a photo of himself in Africa, and he put it up to the camera. And what we haven't done yet, which I think would be great for you guys to do, is to involve some other member of your family in your storytelling. So, and that could be for the whole story, or you could bring in a person at a certain dramatic moment in your story. So you don't have to have the person involved all the way through, or you can. So there are just different ways that you can play with this.
Okay, thank you. I'm just doing a time check. I think we have a lot more. I think we may need another additional 10 minutes on top of it. I don't know with my co-speaker if everybody's available, but I'm just like being realistic. So I'm just putting that out there. All right.
I'm good for it.
We'll stick with you as long and yeah, an extra 10 minutes. And anybody who has to leave, it's totally understandable if you have to leave.
Great. Well, in talking about time, we're going to talk a little bit about timing and in this section here, which is about, I said in the beginning, I am an oral storyteller, an audio storyteller. I do podcasts. And so a lot of the emphasis and training that I have is in voice. Because we're on Zoom, and because I believe all of you are going to be performing on Zoom, I want to focus not just on the physical, but also the voice. So when we're talking about telling stories, especially from what I understand, a majority of you, English is not your first language. That is a really important distinction to make when you are training your voice to tell a story in English, in any language, really. So this hopefully will be helpful for you for delivering your story. The biggest part is warming up. Before you decide to tell your story, you want to warm up and you want to be able to practice. And I'm sure Paul and the rest of the team are going to continue to encourage you to practice your storytelling. Part of that is warming up your voice like an instrument, right? So one of the things that you can do is get silly. If you are off camera, you don't have to worry about anybody seeing you. Before you even get on the meeting, do something like say strange words, or the easy way is just to do this, to blow air out your lips, like it just loosens up and relaxes your face, relaxes your mouth, relaxes your tongue, and the rest of your body when you get silly. And actually, Joshua mentioned, can you develop a humorous story? Absolutely. And preparation for a humorous story, you want to get a little bit, you want to loosen up. Another part is like, standing up, doing jumping jacks, getting your heart moving, or just moving your body in a way that loosens you up, gets you ready to express yourself. Another part that we actually showed you was the color coding in your scripts that helps you practice. So you have a connection to different emotional beats in your story. Making sure you script things out. Obviously, you won't have a script, or you might not have a script when you actually perform, but writing one out, again, allows you to practice how the story flows, and obviously practice out loud. The other way to practice is to drink water. You want to make sure you're hydrated, so you're not dry mouth. And so sometimes what happens is if you are dehydrated, your mouth gets sticky and it doesn't sound as good. That's another big part of this. The biggest thing I will say, if you take one thing away from this slide, it's to breathe and slow down. I direct voice actors for my shows, professional voice actors, and even professional voice actors need to be reminded to slow down and to breathe, because breath makes story more interesting, right? So you're building when you can slow down, and the same thing when shaping your tone. I'll show you how a warm introduction is the same way in many different cultures. Is when you start a story, you're like, I want to tell you this. There's something interesting here. I remember the day that my brother went missing. You're inviting people into your life, your experiences, and the way you shape your sentences can start by breathing and slowing down. You want to lean in. You use your body and your voice to lean in and bring people in. When you're doing this rising action, when things are getting more interesting, you want to elongate your words. You want to get louder. You want to get interesting. And falling action, you want to emphasize the big part, because you know when things are going to get big and sudden, and finally there's a reveal. That is how you can get louder, or you can get softer. And you're like, they finally understood that this lesson was so important. Using different shapes to your tone. For especially, Bilal, as a non-native English speaker, slowing down doesn't just help native English speakers or native speakers of any language telling a story, it helps everyone tell a better story. So, any questions on delivery and voice techniques before we get to our last exercise? All right.
I wanted to, about the voice technique, was just proposing, could one give a speech while standing? Because in most cases, when you're standing, there is good voice projection compared to when you're sitting down.
Absolutely. And actually, you can, if you are having to sit down, so standing actually might be a really good way to tell your story, especially if you plan to move around. I'm from a culture, my family, the Cuban side of my family, we speak with our hands. So if I really want to have certain impacts, I have to make sure, one, that my computer or wherever I'm recording is placed in a way that I'm not going to bump it or, knock it off, right? But standing can also help you breathe better. It can also help you relax. If you're not standing, one thing I will recommend is you sit at the edge of your seat. Don't lean back, sit at the edge and keep your spine straight and your shoulders back and relaxed. That opens up your lungs and your chest so that you can breathe better, and it actually tells your body to relax. So yes, thank you, Joshua. That's a really good point, that even your body and your position of your body can help you breathe better and give you more breath support. So people who are singers or who have singing instruction might also know this too, that it is also helpful. All right. And I'm handing it back. Oh, Fatima, voice variation, facial expressions, the preparation and warm up. If you want to scrunch up your face and then go like that, that can also loosen up your face, get ready to do expressions or mimic other people. It is a very important part of storytelling. Thank you, Fatima.
Lizette, did you want me to go through this one?
Go for it. Yes.
Okay. All right. So warm read. So I actually learned these notations from her. So as you can see, when you're practicing your own story or reading someone else's story for the first time, you may not know specifically how it's read. So this way, you're going to want to practice, and you're going to say, oh, where can I have the impact? Where do I want to slow down? Or where do I want to speed up or punch it up? And just as Lizette was just saying, where do you have time to breathe? And that's really important. So here is an excerpt from the story, and you can see there's notations here. You have an asterisk telling you when you should take a breath. You have a caret telling you when to punch it up to give more emphasis. And then you have a part where things that are underlined that are telling you to slow down. And you may feel that there's other parts you need to add to the story, but these are help guide you as you read. So would anybody else who would like to go read this with knowing these notations? Okay, Mohammed, you wanted to give it a go?
And actually, before you start,
Oh.
Mohammed, if you want to do something to warm up, if you want to just make a weird sound or scrunch at your face, again, do that practice warm up. You can even do it off screen if you want to turn off the video, but
Yeah,
to again do the practice.
The problem is, just I hold the phone with my left hand, and also just only I have one hand. Yeah, that's okay. Yes. I'm gonna get it. I was shooting some hoops in my backyard when I heard my mom called for my little brother Daniel. After Daniel didn't answer, my mom appeared in the backyard. When she didn't see him, her face dropped as I saw worry wash over her face. My brother Daniel was only 3 years old and he was missing. My mom, dad, and I searched our home, but we couldn't find him. We called out his name, Daniel, Daniel, but he didn't answer. My dad and I walked up and down. My dad and I walked up and down the blocks in our neighborhood, but we still couldn't find him. With nowhere else to search, my mom called the police for help. The police arrived quickly, and I listened as my mom provided them with a description of my brother.
Thank you so much. And you can see, having the notations, helps guide how helps guide you how I want you to read the story. So if you think about, Lizette talks about, how she directs people's voices, she's to help them read. And if you think about a director of a movie when they're helping different actors, the actor may read it and they might be like, I want to read it like this, one way, but the director's like, actually, you need to put more emphasis here because we want to make the audience feel in a certain way. So it's a guide. And it also, to me, this always reminds me of music, when you're reading music, how to sing something, depending on what type of emotion you want to exude or you want people to feel, you want to, follow a certain way of singing. So this is really a guide, this is a guide of how to read. So when you're telling your own story, you're going to think about how you want to read it, because that's a personal thing. How do you want people to feel? And that's why it'll be good for you to practice and also record yourself so you can see how you sound. Because you might think you sound one way in your head, but then when you listen to yourself actually speak, you might think, oh, I actually need to sound more excited, or I need to slow down. People won't be able to understand what I'm saying, or I need to emphasize a point, so I want to slow down so people really hear it.
And practicing with other people too is, I'm not sure, Paul, if you have, or you encourage them to tell their story out in front of other people before they perform it here. But having a good friend who's willing to help you, listen to you, or suggest different things is also really helpful, because you're going to be doing this without necessarily a script in front of you when you finally perform it. You want to be able to practice enough to be able to memorize what parts you want to emphasize, and to know what how to do it without looking at those notes. But I would say do at least one recorded version where you are using that script, and do one recorded version without. That I think will also help. If that's all you can do, that would be what I would recommend.
So now I mean, we're over, but we do have, if anybody can continue sticking around, if you have any questions, you can either type them in or raise your hand, and we'll try and answer them. Chia?
And Ben, do you want to close down the presentation so we can all see each other? Or does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Thanks everyone for the presentation. It was really nice. But I want just to ask this quick question, like, are we going to have the PDF?
Oh, yeah,
the
he
video.
wants to know, are we going
recording.
to share the slides? Yeah.
Yes, you'll have both
Okay,
the slides and the video recording of this meeting.
Oh, right. Thanks so much. That's good.
Leroy, I also see Leroy's hand up.
Yes, I was wondering to ask a question about the emotional aspect of the story. If your emotion that will be introduced in your story can be maybe something harsh or something soft that will suggest to somebody that, oh yes, the situation at this point in time of the story is really, really harsh, or at this point is of soft emotion that was introduced by the actors during that time of the story. So is it that you can decide for yourself when to introduce that emotion, or you can just introduce it at any point in time of the story?
Truly, you can introduce it at any part in the story. One of the things, if you want to say, it's natural for when you're talking about a harsh or an angry part of the story that you yourself become angry. Consider if you want to be a little bit more creative. If you know how some people have different ways of showing anger, sometimes they show it very serious and very quiet. If to have what's called tension, you can make your audience feel that tension. If you want them to feel that, if you want them to feel angry, you can yourself show anger. There's many different ways to show emotion. You don't necessarily have to do it one way or another. You get to choose. But I encourage you to be thoughtful and creative. Think deeply. Is this character angry? Or should we be angry when because sometimes there's characters who've experienced trauma that are not angry until after it happens, right? That's an emotional complexity. So if you want to put that complexity in the story, I encourage you to explore different ways to do so. Or you can make it easy and simple and clear and show your emotion connected to the characters in any portion or part of the story. Does that make sense?
Yes, that was great.
Of course.
Anyone else with any last questions? And I want to say, I don't, if someone comes up with something later and, we can pass that on to Paul, we can certainly do a, follow up if there's something that, Paul, you can't answer.
Yep, absolutely. So in the interest of time, I think we probably should wrap things up, but I really want to thank our three presenters, Bethany, Ben, and Lisette. This was actually, I think, even better than the last year, because in part you guys made some edits, I noticed, to your presentations, and they were really, I think, particularly Ben, the slide where you're actually color coding the different parts of the story and so on. I don't know if you did that last year, but in any case, it was excellent. And yeah, this I think underscores more than anything that your stories are your opportunity to change people, to have an impact on people, and therefore it's a performance, and you can change various parts of your performance to make it more interesting. So this is your opportunity to act in order to impact us. And I'm really looking forward to the kinds of stories you guys are going to develop. Just keep in mind that I want to remind you, you'll have 5 minutes to tell your story, right? So you want to write it down in such a manner that it fits within 5 minutes, and it can be less than 5 minutes. We've had stories that were like 3.5 minutes. And it has to be about family in some manner. Doesn't necessarily have to be about your family, but it should be about a family that you know, and it should connect to some sort of bigger issue that impacted that family, whether it's an internal issue within the family or an issue affecting the family from without. So keep those conditions in mind. And next week, it's really the beginnings of you guys telling your stories. If you have, and I'll post this also to the Facebook chat, but if any of you want to practice your story next Sunday, you should let us know that it's probably best to say this in the Facebook chat, so that we know who wants to practice their story first next week. Leroy, you've got a question?
Yes, I have a question to ask.
Go ahead quickly.
Okay, so I was thinking if the various titles you give to the story after the pre-storytelling will be the one used by the various storytellers doing the practice session and that of the post-story session. We are also develop our own story title to give to our stories.
You're talking about story title?
Yeah, I can remember our record after we tell our first story. Our first stories, you wrote some notes in the chat, Zoom chat, about the various stories, how you think they are. So I was thinking if we can use the description you give to the story to maybe use it as our headline for our various stories, or we can still develop our own story titles.
Yes, great question. Actually, this is not something we've actually talked about, Bethany, Lisette, and Ben, but story title. And last year, I just came up with titles, and they were not particularly good titles. So you should definitely come up with your own story title, and perhaps you guys can give some quick guidance about like literally what a written story title would be that could catch people, I suppose. Do you have a quick suggestion?
It's a short, it's what I said about the hook. It's you want to have even that hook, say the example for the Wizard of Oz. Granted, that is an interesting title that's not necessarily to the hook, but say for example, Ben's the day my brother went missing. That is a good title. It's short and it's clear and it's part of the hook. So if you have a similar way to again make that short and connected to the hook or a part of the hook, that's an easy way. So once I've always been told by my writing instructors to never title your work until you're finished. So because you know your story better once you finish writing it, and then you can find maybe different pieces to make obviously the hook, and then the hook can influence the title.
Bethany or Ben?
That was great.
Bethany or Ben, anything you want to add? No? Okay.
No, no.
Chia, I think we're gonna go with you, and then we'll stop with questions, because you guys can ask questions in the Facebook chat, and I want to be cognizant of everybody's time, or respect everybody's time. Chia?
Yes, I was like saying, because if you know your story, you don't need to write your story before you choose the topic. Like if you know your story, you should know the topic already, right?
Yeah, except
mean-
you're gonna have time to develop it, right? And so you may change.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Mine-
So yeah, I mean, all the time. I mean, there's a reason, we think about professional authors, they're always editing. They may come up with one thing and they're like, oh, actually, that's something else is more interesting. They could take it in a different direction. I think that's also why it's helpful to listen, like record yourself and listen to yourself tell your story, as well as tell your story to someone else, because someone can give you feedback that you may think one thing and then you hear it, or someone else sees something and you're like, oh, I didn't know someone would think that way when they hear it, or I sound a lot different, or that maybe that doesn't sound as interesting as I thought it would once I listened to it back, or maybe it sounds wonderful. So that's being open to your own feedback and others to help you.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
So you're going to get the slides, you're going to get the video recording. You're also, as I just mentioned earlier to you, you're going to get this guide to storytelling, which will include a number of links to examples of good storytelling, different kinds of examples, many of them related to family. So you're going to have lots to work with over the next 4 weeks as you guys practice your stuff on Sundays. But also just keep in mind, as Ben and Lisette pointed out, you can practice this with other people. And you should, your friends, your family, etc., and so forth, before you do your final performances on October, I think it's 15th and 22nd. Those are the 2 Sundays when you guys will be performing your post stories. We'll be recording those again. The next 4 weeks, we do not record you. But in October 15th and 22nd, we will be recording you again, so that we can compare those pre-stories you told us with those post stories. And we look forward to seeing how much you've improved. So, all right. With all that said, I'm excited to start with next week. I want to thank again Lisette, Ben, and Bethany for their insights and for their tips. Really, really helpful. And Anya, thank you for keeping with us and tracking attendance and participation, and for all of you for being really engaged. Thanks for your Zoom chat comments and your questions. Really looking forward to your stories starting next week.
Bye-bye.
And everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.